Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Slavery Book Talk, hosted by me, Ana Lúcia Araújo, historian at Howard University. And today we are here to discuss the new book, Traders in Men, Merchants and the Transformation of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, Transatlantic Slave Trade, that was published with Yale University Press this summer. And this book is authored by historian Nicholas Radburn, who is our guest today. Then welcome, Nick. It's a pleasure to have you here today to discuss your... Yeah, you are welcome. It's great to have you here to discuss this great new book. And we have for about 1 hour, and I will just introduce you to the listeners who perhaps do not know your work. Then Nicholas Radburn, he is a historian of the Atlantic world with a particular focus on the transatlantic slave trade. Then, in addition to this book, that is the book that you are discussing today, Traders in Men, that was just published with Yale University Press, he has been working on 3 major projects. One of them is the Slave Voyages database. Then he is the co-editor of the database, and this is a major project that has been around for several years. It's funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities in the United States and the UK Arts and Humanities Research Council. And this is intended to be a digital memorial to the 12.5 million enslaved Africans who were brought by force to the Americas. He is also the principal investigator on the project that is titled Towards a Digital Archive of the Atlantic Slave Trades, Unlocking the Records of the South Sea Company, which is also funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities and the AHRC in the UK. Finally, he is also a co-investigator in the project that is a well-known project worldwide, Legacies of the British Slave Trade. And in addition to that, for those of you who visit the website of the Slave Voyages database, Nick is responsible for the creation of 2 digital models of 2 French slave ships that the videos are there. And these are very useful videos to show how the slave ships worked during the era of the Atlantic slave trade, 2 specific ones. And this was work done by Nick, and you can use those projects, those videos in the classroom. Now, Nick, again, thank you for accepting coming and being part of this very new podcast. And I would like to start asking you a question. Then there is a question that I asked to many of the guests. Then your book, Traders in Men, Merchants and the Transformation of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, then was just published this summer by Yale University Press. And your listeners perhaps do not know exactly what the book is about. Perhaps they didn't read it, but they want to. Tell us what the book is about, and including what regions and what periods your book cover.
Sure. So the book really seeks to answer a simple question, and that's why did Britain's slave trade grow so large during the 18th century? And when I say large, I mean it becomes the largest slave trade in the Atlantic world. It bolts ahead of the Portuguese, which had long been the largest slave trade in the Atlantic. And the reason I want to answer that question is because if you look at the slave trade in the 17th century, before 1700, it's very small. If you look at it in Britain, it's focused solely in London. If you look at it in Africa, it's located principally in the Bight of Benin and on the Gold Coast to a lesser extent. And in the Americas, it's really a trade that's largely to Barbados, and with a growing trade to places like Jamaica. What you see in the 18th century is an explosion in this side of that trade. It moves out of London into first Bristol and then Liverpool, especially Liverpool. It grows across the entirety almost of the West African coast, so it encompasses about 3,500 miles of coastline that the Britons trade to, with major new markets in places like modern-day Nigeria and modern-day Ghana. And it expands massively and cancerously across the Americas, so that Britons will disembark captives in locations starting in far south as Buenos Aires and going as far north as Virginia, in Maryland, and New York, with everywhere else in between. And in terms of the sheer numbers of people who are dragged into that trade as well, you see that transformation. The trade pre-1700, Britons enslaved about 430,000 people according to the Slave Voyages database. Now that's not an insignificant number. Each one of those people is a man, woman, or child who was dragged into the horrors of the slave trade. But in the 18th century, that trade increases to such an extent that Britons will carry off 2.8 million people, and 400,000 of whom will perish at sea, making Britons by far the largest slave traders in the Atlantic world, and contributing enormously to the overall size of the trade, not only in terms of the sheer number of people, but where it's located. And so that's the phenomenon I'm interested in, and the answer that I give why is to really explore the people who drive it by looking at the so-called traders in men, the merchants, the slaving merchants who animate this business. And not just merchants in Britain, I could have written that story, but merchants in Africa, on the African coast, but also in the African interior who are enslaving people, and indeed in the Americas, the people who are selling the captives come off the ships. So the question is really, what animates them? Who are they? What motivates them? And what is it about them that animates, that drives this trade up so enormously? And the other aspect of this story I wanted to explore as well is, how do we get to a point by the late 18th century where Britain's slave trade is so large, but also has a sort of standardized set of practices to it? So if you look at the slave trade as described in other works that look at it in its maturity in the late 18th century, there's a particular way in which people are sold on the African coasts, transported on the ships, and then sold in the Americas. So I was interested in interrogating how do we get to the point where we have that set of practices that historians can identify and recognize, but also that people like abolitionists can describe at the end of the 18th century.
Great. Then this is a nice overview, and I think that one of the interesting points in the book is really the fact that it goes to the African coasts and also shows this dimension of the trade there, and not only along the coast, but indeed in the interior as well. And one of the elements here about this monograph is really that is very easy to read. Then the writing is very clear and very accessible to any readers, even I would say to people who perhaps are not familiar with the subject. But this is your first monograph, and this is a book that derives from your doctoral dissertation, which this is what I believe then at Johns Hopkins, where you got your doctoral degree here in the US. And I would like us to discuss a little bit, that you tell us about how and why you decided to do research on this particular topic, and also the kind of challenges you had to transform what was in the beginning a dissertation into a book. Of course, many people who are perhaps listening are then the general public, but there are also students and perhaps doctoral students who are listening to us. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So it's true that it does derive from my PhD thesis, but you actually have to go back a little further, because in a way, the roots of this project go all the way back to 2006, when I started working on slave trading merchants as an MA student. At that point, I was still living in New Zealand. That's where I started work on this topic. And I wrote that MA on Liverpool slave trader William Davenport, who'd outfitted about over 100 slave ships. And his papers were pretty well preserved. There've been two sets of them. One what we knew about, and then one that had been discovered through the Antiques Roadshow program, of all places, all of which have been put online, so I could access them in New Zealand. So I started out researching him, and that was my sort of entree to the world of slave trade studies, and particularly focusing on slave trading merchants. And at the time, I was very interested in who he was, how his business operated, but also especially his profits. That was really what the point of that was. But also, in interrogating that, a lot of what I was looking at was how he developed his business to orient it towards the African coast, and particularly two different markets that he was buying captives in. So that was really what got me started to research slave trading merchants, was working on Davenport. You can still find that thesis up online. And at the same time, I was an RA on the Diary of Antera Duke project, which was a publishing the diary of a slave trader at Old Calabar. And so I was simultaneously researching African slave traders as well, and getting very interested in like the interactions between slave traders in Liverpool and slave traders in places like Old Calabar. When I went to Hopkins to do my PhD, I was doing some research and managed to, on some microfilm, and stumbled on the fact that there was this guy called John Taylor, who was a major slave trader in Jamaica. He sold something like 20,000 people in the late 18th century, Africans coming off of the slave ships. And as it transpires, his papers had been bought at the Clements Library. So I went off and researched those and turned it into a paper that was an article published in the WMQ that was about his profits again, who he was, how he operated his business. But especially that was really helpful for me to start thinking about slave sales, which is such an important part of this book. How are people being sold in the Americas? And then also how are people being sold on the African coast? And that's where I really started to think about the gender, age, and health of enslaved people being very important for shaping their ultimate destinies within and beyond these slave sales, and then ultimately through the entire process of the slave trade. And that was really what animated my PhD, was trying to put those three components together: the British merchants, the African merchants, and the merchants in the Americas, and look at that process of enslavement, the moment of enslavement in the African interior, following captors all the way through to their final sale, and even seasoning. I'd follow them out the other side onto plantations once they reached the Americas in the late 18th century. So I had a chapter on each of those steps of the way. It was really focused on the slave experience, though. It was very interested in focusing in a granular way on what happens to enslaved people as they move through. And slave trading merchants were there in the background, obviously were important, but they weren't the primary actors in this story. And so when I finished the thesis, I was pleased with what I produced, but analytically there wasn't a great deal I wasn't happy with the substance of it. You know, my dissertation committee sort of said, okay, you've done a really great job piecing this all together, but what's the big takeaway here? What have you found? And so when I stepped back from that thesis and thought about producing a book, that's when and had some time to think about it because I had a postdoc year. That's when I started to think about putting merchants back into the story and thinking more about what is it about these people that motivates them, and what is about their businesses that means we get this process of enslavement that I documented in my PhD. And so I really, tried to then create a book that was more about both sides of the coin: the slave experience, which obviously has to be fundamentally part of the story, and I want this book to be about enslaved people, but also the enslaved, but also the enslavers, the victims of the perpetrators, and to show that we have to talk about the enslavers if we want to understand what happens to the enslaved. That really set me on the path to really overhauling almost entirely the thesis. I completely rewrote the first chapter. I got rid of the last chapter and turned it into a shrunk down journal article. I rewrote the introduction and conclusion from top to bottom. I added in a new fourth chapter that was about the movement of slave ships through the Americas, which is something that historians hadn't really talked about, and what that's like for the captives on board. Extended the time frame back to think much more about the roots and origins of these processes that I described in my thesis. Where do they come from and why, especially in that important period of the late 17th and early 18th century. And then finally, this might be helpful for young parents, I had kids. And that really made a huge difference to my working process. I sent the first full manuscript of this off to the publisher 12 hours before my first daughter was born, and I sent off the final copy edited manuscript a week before my second daughter was born. And then I had to do a lot more of trying to juggle working on the book around having children. So I'm not saying this just to be silly. It was more that it was more like trying to do the writing process and fit it in a lot more around life and you know, the complexities of having to juggle family life and research time.
You know, it's important because it shows like that this can be like this is a third baby in a certain way, one
Yeah,
that is older and took longer to
yeah.
be out than the other ones, and also the fact, of course, that you are writing about people, and this dimension is certainly important. Nick, and another element also that I think that is important for people who are listening to us is, of course, that it is important to detail and to go in depth about the mechanisms of the trade in these various stages and in various locations, because the structure that was needed to develop this trade took a lot of time to be put in place. Of course, the 18th century is the summit of this, and I think that your book shows this in detail, then how these different people operate. And it's also important because if you are retracing, and this the other projects that you are part of, if you are trying to retrace where the money came from and where the money, the profits went, after it, we need to follow these traders as well. Now, one of the elements that I would like to ask you is, then we know that the British slave trade, the British Atlantic slave trade, that someone who does not focus on British in particular, but this is one of the trades that has been the most examined slave trades in academic books. And this, of course, from a variety of angles. And I would like to know then, what are the main important points that you would like us to take from the book that were not covered, haven't been covered by other books, existing books about the British Atlantic slave trade? Because, of course, the British slave trade is huge. The 18th century is the most important one. Many of the books that are published in English are about the British Atlantic slave trade, but still this book brings many new dimensions that were not studied, documents that were not previously explored, and dimensions as well. Then would you like to emphasize those for us?
Yeah, sure. I mean, you're absolutely right that there's a preponderance of books on Britain's slave trade, especially vis-a-vis something like the Portuguese / Brazilian slave trade, which was much larger and yet has a much smaller literature, especially in the English language. That being said, that there is still a lot more to be done on Britain's slave trade. And the reason is there is no sort of single volume history of Britain's slave trade. And I don't profess to have written that. There is room for that to be done. And also, there's a lot more books written on Britain's role in abolition than there is as a slave trading nation, which I always find to be still quite remarkable. So there is space, I think. And that's what I'm sort of trying to do here, is fill some of that space. But you're also right, there are loads of really excellent books out there. And I've been really blessed since I started my academic career working on this at a postgraduate level from 2006 to have really seen a renaissance in slave trade studies focused on Britain's slave trade. Because when I started out, you know, the sort of literature I was engaging with, especially when I was working on the sort of business history of a British slave trader, was very economic, very dry, very focused on numbers, very focused on narrow questions about profitability and that kind of thing. And I was happy to engage with that. But there was remarkably little on the slave experience, or situating enslaved people in the story, or acknowledging their humanity, really. And since then, we've had wonderful books by Marcus Rediker and Stephanie Smallwood. It came out pretty much simultaneously in 2007. A more recent work by Swanda Mustakim, Slavery at Sea, which came out in 2016, about a couple of months after I finished my PhD, actually. Wonderful work by Emma Christopher on slave ship sailors. And they've really fleshed out that story of the slave experience. And also some of those things I talk about in this book, a processes by which enslaved people were captured, forced aboard the ships, and sold to the Americans. What Mustakim calls the human manufacturing process, which I think is a really clever and insightful way to describe it, because it gets to that sense of slaving as an industrial process with methods that its practitioners utilize to manufacture people, as she describes, transport them and move the product as the slave trade initiative. So it's been great to understand. And then, of course, there's all sorts on the Royal African Company, and also on that quantitative side of it, that long history of quantitative studies of the slave trade. Right. So that's the existing landscape. Where do I see myself in? Well, the main thing I want to do is to really bring slave trading merchants into the picture, to give a clearer sense of why we see the things we do that appear in those books. Why does Britain's slave trade take the particular form it does? Why does the Middle Passage look like it does? Why are enslaved people sold in particular ways in Africa and the Americas? Why do we see these huge slave societies, slave capturing societies appearing in Africa, and then plantation societies in the Americas, which are fueled by the slave trade as well? Why is the slave trade so violent, and particularly violent and brutal, and dehumanizing towards its victims? Why is it so premised on the commodification of people and the removing their humanity? And also, I wanted to go beyond here as well, looking at the Royal African Company. I'm not saying the Royal African Company isn't important, and I'm sure we might get onto this in our conversation, but it has had a disproportionate amount of focus, especially vis-a-vis the people who really drive and animate Britain's slave trade to its peak, which are fairly peripheral people in Bristol and Liverpool, especially Liverpool. And there's very little written on those people, even though they are the key actors. So in doing so, I want to highlight the origins of slaving merchants, their motivations, and to connect them all together, to think about them as a cohesive group. There are linkages between those people in Britain and Africa and the Americas that go beyond the fact they're sort of in partnership in business, but they share common origins, sort of lowly social background. They share similar motivations in terms of their goals. They share a similar view of enslaved people as commodities. They share similar practice in terms of how they violently dehumanize the slaves, either in sales or on the ships. And in so doing, I want to add to some of that rich literature on the slave experience. As you alluded to in one of your early questions, what I try to do here is give some equal weight to those sales of people in Africa and the Americas with the Middle Passage, which has had a huge amount of focus on it. I don't deny that the Middle Passage is an important part of the slave experience and of that human manufacturing process, but it is one stage of it. And so we need to give due regard to what happens in Africa and the Americas as well, especially on either side. I also sort of explore voyages of slave ships through the American waters, which, as I show here, does give us a new dimension to the Middle Passage as well, and the fates of enslaved people who don't follow the typical path we expect of sailing Africa aboard the ships. What happens to the people who are left behind, but also what happens to the people in the Americas who aren't sold to plantations. And what I show here is they're shunted into a very sophisticated and complicated set of secondary markets, which are designed to sort of extract value from their bodies. As I mentioned several times too, I want to know and demonstrate here that there's a lot of change over time in Britain's slave trade. It's very easy to look at it in its maturity and assume that that's how it's always was in terms of the practice of the slave trade. But what I show here is there's a lot of change, especially in the late 17th, early 18th century, as slave traders are trying to work out how this trade will operate, how they will enslave people, increase efficiency, which is something we might talk about as we go through, to increase profits, reduce risk, and the consequences of that for enslaved people. Finally, one of the things I really wanted to do here, especially given that I work on the Slave Voyages project, is show the utility of melding that rich human history that historians have increasingly utilizing, and rightly so, to study the slave trade, to put people front and center with quantitative data, with numbers. There is a way you can do both. I hopefully have shown that that's a fruitful approach here.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and of course that there is this entire discussion on numbers, but the numbers have also fueled all the discourses trying to measure dehumanization. And I think that you do this nicely in the book in showing that. One of the questions that I have, perhaps that you can tell us a little bit more, that is related to how your book then brings new elements that we didn't know about the British slave trade, is about your primary sources, the sources that you use in this book. Then if you can tell us a little bit more about the primary sources, what are these primary sources, in which archives they are, which archives did you visit, and if you see any kinds of advantages or limitations of the kinds of sources that you use or that were available for you to use?
Yeah, sure. Well, as you would imagine, with a book that's focused so heavily on slave trading merchants, the primary source base for this were the papers of those slave traders. And as I mentioned in one of my previous answers, I started out by researching the papers of one Liverpool slave trader, albeit one whose papers were very, very extensive. They're the largest collection we have, William Davenport. And his papers were very heavy on financial accounts and accounts of individual slave ships, and very thin on letters and things that sort of give more of a qualitative sense of his business. So a lot of what I had to do there, and this is something I've carried on doing as I've worked on other slavery merchants' papers, is look at accounts, ledgers, and financial records. And the reason I could do that is before I became a historian, I had about 4 years training to be an accountant for my sins. I was actually an auditor at one of the major accounting firms. So I had sort of the training to be able to go understand double entry bookkeeping and how accounts work, and I applied that knowledge to studying the accounts. But subsequently, I've looked at pretty much any records I could lay my hands on of British slave traders, and indeed other slave traders from France and Holland and Denmark and so forth. A lot of that I've had to sort of peel off for subsequent projects. So the papers of a major Bristol slave trader down in the National Archives in London, John Taylor's papers at the Clements in Michigan, which were hugely extensive and unmined by anyone who worked on the slave trade previously, and were principally letters about his business rather than financial accounts. So it gave a really rich understanding of how the slave trade operates in Jamaica, which is the largest British slave trading market in the Americas. And I was able to look at that for the first time. And then, of course, the Royal African Company's papers, which are located in the National Archives, which also have the sort of subsidiary firm which runs right the way through to the end of the 18th century. That's a real sort of miscellany of not only the company's papers for its management of its slave trading activities in the late 17th century, but also a lot of documents to do with how people are slave trading on the African coast throughout the 18th century. Letters going back and forth between captains and officers ashore about very mundane day-to-day business of enslaving people, shipping people to and from the ships, purchasing people, violence towards people. So, you know, by the time I came to write this book, I've been working on, in fact, by this year, I've been working on slave traders' papers for about 15 years. So by that point, you know, I sort of looked at pretty much everything that was out there, my hands on. In terms of the advantages of those papers, you know, one thing that's always struck me about slave traders, papers of slave traders, is they don't hide what they're doing because they don't feel the need to an extent. You know, their financial records are very keen to record the deaths of enslaved people, their poor physical health, or their prices, which you can glean some information from. Their letters usually include a lot of information about sickness and mortality and those kind of things. So the business is quite starkly revealed to you in very cold and rational terms through these papers. But therein lies the problem, of course, as well, right? People are reduced to numbers. People are reduced to a notation and an account book, enslaved people. This fragmentary nature of the source base is really striking. There's a huge gap in the first part of the 18th century, in particular, for these records. So they give you quite a lot about how slave traders operated their business, but they don't give you everything you want as a historian, especially about the slave experience. And to get that, you need to go off and look at these voluminous amount of evidence that was collected for the abolitionist inquiries, where they got a lot of slave ship sailors and captains and merchants and witnesses to the trade in the late 18th century. been asked an enormous number of questions about what they saw of the trade, and that really helps to sort of go beyond these financial accounts and letters of slave trading merchants. I looked at those when I was still in New Zealand because they were available digitally. I actually printed them all out as like binders with like 2,000 pages of them. I went through by hand. Now I have them all in PDF. Published primary sources, of course, pamphlets, especially once you get to the abolition era that describes the slave trade, both pro and anti, but there's a huge amount of information there, descriptions of West Africa, and like slave trading there and in the Americas, and of course slave narratives, which are very useful for getting glimpses of the slave experience. It's not perfect, but use those as much as I possibly can. And then finally, what was really fruitful as well for fleshing out the story of West Africa in particular, and the ways that people were enslaved in the interior, was drawing on the rich literature of African historians who've looked at a lot of these individual slaving societies and produced really vivid portraits of the people who inhabit them, the growth of the slave trade in these areas, the motivations of the actors engaged in that business. You know, the kind of work like Ugo Nkweji's work on the Bight of Biafra, for example, which is wonderful at sort of exploring why the slave trade grows so large there, not by looking from the coast, but by looking from the interior outwards. And that's what I was interested in. So trying to draw all that together, you know, synthesize all that work, having the slave trading merchants papers as a sort of spine, but then making sure I went beyond those to flesh out the story and make sure due regard was given to, especially to their enslaved victims. That was really the challenge of this project in terms of the research.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, and of course that you need at least then you are able to connect these different sources to provide at least a glimpse of what the experience of enslaved people could be in these different just different stages, which remains a challenge even for those who are only focusing on one single dimension of the Atlantic slave trade. Now, one of the then when you outline then the arguments of your book in the introduction, we have each argument corresponding then to one specific chapter. And you emphasize then that slave merchants, they shared similar strategies that rely then on Atlantic networks, and also another element that mattered for them was age, sex, and health of enslaved people. Then that these were crucial elements influencing then how they decided to purchase particular enslaved Africans and go to particular ports. My question then is the following: to which extent this kind of feature that you emphasize in the book is specific to the British slave trade, and to which extent perhaps they are shared with these other traders, Dutch, Portuguese, French, and even Brazilian and US traders? Because you tell me, of course, you are focusing on these archives on British slave merchants, but you are seeing these other traders working in the same areas, and of course you are reading the secondary literature. What are the elements here that are exceptional and that are similar?
Yeah, so that sort of focus on age, sex, and gender is what emerged from my thesis, because really what I was trying to understand by piecing together the entirety of that process of enslavement from capture to final destination in the Americas was, what was it that determined how someone who started here would end up here, or indeed over here in a separate location? What were the factors that sort of changed the destinations of people of forced migration as they went through? And age and sex were crucial, as I discovered, whether someone's an adult or a child, or indeed someone who's an older person. Gender, men and women took different paths to the trade, but health was a really important one I kept coming back to and kept seeing come up time and time again in slave trading merchants' papers. And that's what other historians are increasingly seeing as well now as well. That's so one of the Muster Keen's books really excellent on pointing that out. And there are lots of wonderful works that are coming out in the future too that are really pivoting to focus closely on health. I think we're going to see a big turn towards a focus on health in the slave trade and away from ethnicity, which is something that's been heavily focused on in the sort of 90s and early 2000s. Now, why that occurs, I argue, is because, you know, slave traders are ruthless and they have a pretty clear-eyed view of what they're doing. They're under no illusions about the fact that if they're, say, purchasing captives on the African coast, they're going to force them aboard ships that are deadly for people who are weak, right? So they sort of weed out the weak on the African coast when they purchase people to only select people who will potentially survive the voyage. It's that brutal and that stark. And likewise, people in the Americas, the slave buyers, are ruthless about selecting people to fit particular requirements. Planters are seeking not sort of young African children, but rather adults who they think can do the heavy work of plantation agriculture. And that leaves those other people, the elderly, the young, the sickly, to be purchased by other groups, right? And that's really the way, when I put it all together, that's sort of what I saw of the slave trade, and that was true throughout, you know, in Africa on the ships or in the Americas. There's these different ways that people are shunted into different directions depending on these categories. Now, your question was how much of that is unique to the British, and I would say very little. I think that's how the slave trade operates in the French Atlantic. I've just written a paper with William and Mary Quarterly that makes that very argument. Right, that's how slave sales operate in Saint-Domingue, for example. And you see similar sort of secondary markets being established there to move people around. I've seen the records for the sale of enslaved people in the Dutch Americas, and they look very, very similar to the French and the British, and indeed the Danish trade as well. Witnesses to slave sales in the Danish islands say they look exactly like they do in the British. So part of the reason for that is because of the gruesome and brutal realities of the slave trade, which is that regardless of the nationality of the slave traders, they're always going to be dealing in enslaved people who are coming off the ships or boarding the ships in varying degrees of health, who are vary in terms of their age, and who are either men or women in varying proportions. So just the reality of the gruesome reality of the business. And that's not going to change if the person's French or British is enslaving them. But I think it's also partly inherent to the slave trades throughout history, I would imagine. I think if you looked at, say, the slave trade in the Roman Empire, you'd see similar mechanisms, similar sort of structures being put in place by slave traders to deal with what happens to people who are sickly, what happens to people who are too old to work or too young to work. I think you'd see similar complex structures, economic structures designed and markets designed to extract value from those people and to shunt them into different pathways of forced migration. So I don't think there's a sort of distinctiveness here besides the size of Britain's slave trade, the numerousness and its import. And the last thing I'll say is there is a process that was at work, and I wasn't able to get into this in the book, in which in the early 18th and late 17th century, there's a lot of change as to how the processes of the slave trade work. And I think in that period, there's a lot of sharing of knowledge between the different slave trading nations. So French slave ship captains will observe what's happening on a British ship and adopt practices and vice versa, and then they'd see what's happening on the Dutch ships or in the Portuguese. And so I think there's something to be done there to look at how this process of creating these standardized mechanisms of enslavement happens and is then disseminated across different European nations.
Yeah, then ultimately what you can see here is that people who are studying other slave trade, other slave trades by other nations, by other European nations, and even American nations, they have a lot to learn from the book, because there are elements that are similar. And at least the book also provides this sort of grid then that this rubric that would allow also to see in other than national slave trades how did it work. Then this is really an interesting component of the book. Now, the book itself, of course, focuses on the 18th century. Then the argument, of course, is that this was a pivotal moment then for the British slave trade and for the overall trade in enslaved Africans. And I ask if you can talk a little bit about the previous century, if you can tell us a little bit about the 17th century, how the British organization of the trade then in the 17th century, through the Royal African Company that you mentioned, and that is usually then the focus, especially when we see, for example, then the pieces for the large public. But I would like to know a little bit more about how the Royal African Company shaped then the trade that is going to occur then in the 18th century. What happened is truly new. What was the change here? This said, of course, you already told us that throughout the 18th century, the British slave trade also changes. But can we come back a little bit to the 17th century?
Yeah, sure. I mean, so the Royal African Company is in many ways of crucial importance for establishing Britain's slave trade. And the reason is because it lays the groundwork of that trade in Britain, Africa, and the Americas. And it actually, there's a reason why it sort of appears in pretty much every chapter when looking at these processes, because usually the company is the germ, or at least the company's agents or organizers, is often the germ of how, say, slave sales in Africa are organized, or in the Americas, or how things are organized on the ships. That being said, well, no, before I get into that being said, let me emphasize too, it's crucial for setting up a permanent presence on the African coast in places like modern-day Ghana, which will be really important for the growth of the slave trade in the 18th century, for teaching via interactions between ship captains and African merchants, those African merchants English, and sort of getting to know English traders, so establishing those partnerships, which are so important to the slave trade. And it's establishing plantation slavery in key places like Barbados, Jamaica, and to a lesser extent Virginia, and for other Caribbean islands as well. So it does play a key role. I don't want to deny that, especially as it's at that crucial period where the English are trying to work out how to operate in the slave trade on both sides of the Atlantic and how to operate the ships. Why I try not to focus too much on it is because it's pretty short-lived. It only really operates for about, is a major player in the slave trade for, something like 20 years before it's completely shunted aside by these private merchants. And if you look at the numbers of people that it enslaves, and numbers obviously aren't everything, the companies involved enslaves about 150,000 people. Now that, again, not insignificant. That's a huge number of people. That's the largest single entity for enslaved people in British history. But just three families in Liverpool enslaved more people than that, right? That gives you the size of these merchants who are operating out of a place like 18th century Liverpool. So while the 17th century trade via that Royal African Company is crucial for sure for establishing Britain's slave trade and setting the seeds for it, it is those private merchants who will really nurture it, the trade, and able to grow in the 18th. So huge number of more people involved. There's something like 10,000 merchants who are involved in slave trading, outfitting slave ships in the 18th century. In Britain, it's much more atomized. These are private merchants. So the 18th century is so different in how you see the trade being organized. And what you also see, and I touched on this at the beginning, is the newness of the business throughout the Atlantic world. New ports in Britain, new ports in Africa, and new ports in the Americas to a large extent as well. That really moves away from that model that the Royal African Company utilized of trying to have the trade isolated in London and then in ports in Africa and then particular markets in the Americas. So if you want to understand that story of growth, you have to understand the importance of the Royal African Company at the beginning, for sure, and its continued importance to a degree as you get onto the 18th century, but you really have to focus on who are the private merchants who supplant the company and why, and what are their motivations, and how are they running their businesses.
Mm-hmm. And then this is interesting. And one of the arguments that you make in the book is about the efficiency of the British slave trade and how this element, this dimension of efficiency was important, and that this allowed then for this big growth of the British slave trade in the 18th century. Could you give us a little bit, some examples, I would say, of what efficiency means in the context of the trade in enslaved Africans, and if you have any examples of this growing efficiency among West African traders as well, who sold then enslaved people to these British slave merchants during the era that you are looking at.
Yeah, I mean, the point I start with at the beginning of the book is that by 1775, Britons will be shipping something like 50,000 people across the Atlantic every single year, right? Up from something like 10,000 at the beginning of the century. So at some level, you have to account for the fact that Britons are able to expand the trade so enormously and do so in the face of enormous resistance from enslaved people in Africa, aboard the ships, and then in the Americas as well. They come up with mechanisms to basically reduce the risk, as they see it, of enslaved people rebelling, seizing the ships, fighting back to a minimal level, such that, you know, hundreds or more ships can cross the Atlantic every year, and most of those will reach the other side with the people still aboard. So that is the very essence of efficiency in the slave trade, and what I mean by that. It's refining the business practices. The slave trade is refining their business practices to such an extent that they are able to send out their ships confident, and they are, in the knowledge that they'll be able to acquire enslaved people in Africa and can get most of them, and many do not make it, as we know, to the other side because they perish at sea, to be sold and then to yield a profit. What does that mean in practical terms, in terms of some examples you asked for? Well, if you look at somewhere like Liverpool, right, which is not engaged in the slave trade at all in 1700 for all intents and purposes, basically doesn't send out any slave ships, and only really takes up as a major slave import in the 1740s, but then will, by the end of the 18th century, be the largest slave trade import in the Atlantic, right? That is accomplished by changing the town, by building docks and quays and warehouses, developing the infrastructure through which goods can be brought down to the town from a huge extensive hinterland. I've recently written about the gunpowder trade and how they could build gunpowder mills in the proximity of Liverpool to supply gunpowder specifically to the slave trade, but also textiles from Manchester, metal goods from Sheffield, guns from Birmingham, so on and so forth, right? Very complex supply chains and infrastructure that's designed to very quickly supply the complex assortment of goods that we need to acquire enslaved people in Africa, and to get those on the ship quickly and get those vessels out to sea, in addition to the human side of it, which is partnerships of merchants, usually migrants from the nearby countryside, who are working in cooperation with each other, extending credit between each other and that kind of thing. Once those ships reach Africa, and this is something I was at pains to explain in the book, they have a wide variety of ports to which they can go. You know, there's something like over 100 slave trading ports in Africa to which British ships trade in the 18th century. But if you look at where the majority of enslaved people are carried from, it's only about 10, right? Something like 50% of the captives are taken. So we focus on one, Bonny, which is a sort of mirror image of Liverpool. That goes from being an insignificant and tiny slave trading port in 1700. If you look on Slave Voyages, it basically has 0 captives taken from it, although there are some, to being the largest slave trading port in West Africa by abolition, right? Second largest after Benin, after Ouidah across the 18th century. And it does so by developing very complex infrastructure that snakes up into the interior with people in society, through which 10,000 people a year can be enslaved, moved to the coast in fleets of canoes, and then sold onto the ships through pretty well structured mechanisms of sale. That's what I explore in the book. So it's really slave trading on an industrial scale. When you look at that Liverpool-Bonny connection, it's a pipeline through which goods can be shipped, manufactured goods can be shipped from Liverpool to an African port and then funneled into the interior to be used to acquire captives who will be taken back down again in their thousands. And that's the level of efficiency that's required to get a slave trade that is so extensive, that has 50,000 people a year being taken across the Atlantic. If you look finally in the Americas at somewhere like Jamaica, which is obviously a huge slave trading port as well, the largest in the British Atlantic, the slave trading merchants there come up with incredibly brutal but incredibly efficient, again, if you want to use that term, ways of selling people, where they can sell an entire shipload, say 400 people, of captives coming off the vessel in an hour to colonial buyers. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's that speed and rapidity with which people can be moved to the coast on the ships across the Atlantic and then distributed out to a wide variety of colonial buyers, leaving no one behind on the vessel, no matter how old, how young, or how sickly. That's the efficiency of trade, and that's what animates it. That's what enables it to grow so large and to grow so insidious by the end of the 18th century.
Yeah, and this is an interesting point, because when you think in terms of you use this word in terms of sort of industrial and modernization and efficiency, and these are terms that we see connected usually to the plantations in the 19th century of secondary slavery, and here we already see this happening to the trade itself than in the previous century. Now I have a long question that I try to not read that too clearly. I have then, of course, that the book is about the British Atlantic slave trade, starting then on African shores, where then British traders purchased African captives. And the first chapter then explores the history of London, Bristol, and Liverpool as being the major British slave ports as well. One dimension that is not your focus here in this book, but is part of the work that you are doing in other projects, is about the profits made by the British during the era of the Atlantic slave trade. And at the end of the day, of course, as we already saw, efficiency was part of the rise of a capitalist economy, a different one, industrial capitalist economy in this period. Now, at the same time, you argue that after the end of the monopoly of the Royal African Company, then we have a rise of what we could call free trade, then of sorts, that we see it's at this moment of this free trade that we have this explosion in terms of number of African ports trading enslaved people. Could you develop a little bit about this issue of free trade, quotation marks, on the African coasts and the profits made from the Atlantic slave trade by the British merchants in the 18th century?
Yeah, I mean, my colleague Will Pettigrew has written extensively. The slave trade is an interesting example of one of the first major trades in Britain to be demonopolized, to be open, to be made free. And the results are, as I show in the book, you really see the sort of ability of capitalism to create new markets, to create growth and efficiency, but obviously in the most violent and brutal and exploitative fashion. So you see sort of capitalism red in tooth and claw here, and the horrors of free markets when unchecked by morality. When you look at the slave trade, in terms of that sheer growth, that's clearly the story here, because you see that explosive growth, and it's driven really by merchants who are operating in a largely unregulated market. In Britain, there's very, very few checks on slave traders until the era of abolition. They can organize their voyages as they see fit. They can pack as many people aboard the vessels as they see fit, and they do to a horrifying degree. And they sell people in the Americas in a pretty much unregulated market. There's very, very few laws on the books connected to the sales of enslaved people in the Americas, with the exception of those that are to do with taxation and public health. But the actual process of sale is largely up to slave trading merchants. Now, interestingly, in West Africa, if you look at how the trade operates there, it is free in the sense that ports, merchants in so many different ports sort of spring up in the same way that we see in Britain and the Americas to engage in the trade. But others do not, and that's important to note as well. Not every African society on the African coast decided to participate in the slave trade, and many were opposed to it. Okay, but if you look at how the trade operates within those ports, it's actually the most regulated of the three legs of the trade. It's much, much more heavily regulated about how enslaved people are sold than in the Americas, and the restrictions on what merchants can and can't do are much, much higher than, say, in Britain. Right? And that's because these ports are usually, if you look at somewhere like Bonny, that I talked about before in modern-day Nigeria, will have a ruling class that needs to control the trade, so its profits percolate to a degree up to them. The king of Bonny is himself a slave trader and is enriched by it, but also so that their own subjects aren't dragged into the trade, and also so there isn't a marketplace that's just chaos where you have 100 or 200 African merchants, which is often the case in these ports, all bidding against each other, racing against each other, trying to capture market share from both the interior and from the visiting ships. So you see a huge amount of regulation there to control prices, control who can and can't, control sell and slave people, on taxation, on who can and can't be sold to the ships, who has to be redeemed from the ships, in a way you just don't see in the Americas. So it's free to an extent in Africa, but really the African merchants are very sophisticated about trying to restrict the trade's pernicious effects on society, economies, etc. It's funny you should mention profits, because profits of the slave trade is really the thing that got me into this project initially, and it's been a sort of constant thing that I come back to as I've gone through through my career studying this subject. It's the topic I keep sort of coming back to. And the reason is, there's a story about the slave trade profits that I think isn't particularly well appreciated, which is just the sheer extent to which this is an incredibly risky business for the people who engage in it, and the profits are incredibly variable. Right? One former slave trading merchant describes it as a lottery. Right? They're sort of over-egging the pudding, but they look at the way the returns are for slave traders on individual voyages. They're right. They go up and down. They go from 100% gains to catastrophic losses. And so the people, once you appreciate that fact, and the reason why they're so variable is because they trade in people, right? Because people fight back, people perish, people get sick. And then there's the hazards of the sea, of ships that are out for a year. This is, one of the riskiest trades that a merchant can be engaged in the 18th century. And once you appreciate that fact, it tells you a lot about why slave traders act like they do, because they're constantly trying to reduce risk by creating these standardized processes of enslavement that I talk about in the book, but also the types of people that the trade attracts, which is fortune hunters, people who are often from a sort of lower middle sort of background, bit of money in their pocket, often from the countryside, who want to risk it all and try and get rich quick. And you see that wherever you look. These are people who are drawn to risk in the hope they can quickly accelerate themselves up the social ladder, even if it means risking death on the West African coast or on a slave ship or in somewhere like Jamaica, in the case of the white merchants. And I would argue that applies to a degree to the African merchants as well. This is a risky business for African slave traders too, and one whose profits vary as well. You wanted to sort of you asked about that impact to the slave trade profits on sort of longer term economic development. And the slave traders I've looked at, some of them do become wildly rich through this business. John Taylor, he arrives in Jamaica in 1783 with about £1,000 to his name, and leaves after a 15-year slave trading career after he sold about 20,000 people with over £100,000. And he comes back to Scotland and he buys a huge manor house that used to belong to his dad that had to be sold because the family was fallen ill times. He clearly wins by the slave trade. There are people like that. There are lots of other examples. William Davenport, who I studied, did very, very well through the slave trade. Again, reinvested the money in a country house. So there are those people, but the ones who we don't really talk about are those who crash and burn through the slave trade, of which there are many examples, who go bankrupt, who slope off back to their country village after or invest in it and quit because it's too risky. And there are plenty of those people in Africa too as well. So that wider question about the slave trade's profits, what sort of contribution do they make to the emerging capitalist world economy, I think isn't nearly as settled as you might think, and it might not be nearly as obvious. Obviously, they have an influence. Obviously, they shape things like the development of manufacturing to supply the slave trade, the growth of plantation economies, the development of these ports in Africa and infrastructure that supplies captives to them. But I think the profits that are coming out of the slave trade, at least from the people I've seen, are going more into the development of things like country houses and conspicuous consumption than they are things like cotton mills and the things, railways and the things we associate with the industrializing 19th century.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Nick. And this is also part of the project on the legacies of the British slave trade, that if people have any interest, they can also check individuals who, after the abolition, but this was not about the trade itself, individuals who were compensated after the abolition, but who were individuals who own enslaved people. But here we are talking really about the trade itself, then purchasing and selling enslaved people. Now I would like to go to our last question, and perhaps the last, but then the title of the book, of course, is about these slave merchants, and the title is Traders in Men. That draws then from your primary sources. I would like to ask you two things. Then one, in terms of the captives who are women and children, and also if there were women traders that appear in your sources, because of course the traders in men are slave traders, then not and they are not only trading men, they are trading women and children. Are there any elements of this dimension of women and children that you would like to add here?
Yeah, you're right to sort of query the title. I sort of went back and forth on it when I selected it. I wanted a neat term that sort of encapsulated slave traders without it being too dry, and to capture the fact that they are in fact dealing in human beings. You know, even the term slave trader, you know, especially as I'm sure in this interview here, you know, I repeat it, and it sort of loses its connection to the brutal realities of their business. So I wanted a quote that sort of captured that. Unfortunately, though, it sort of gives the impression that what I'm talking about are men trading men, which isn't the case. And that's what I try and show in this book, right? The slave trade is because of who's been enslaved in Africa and who's being moved aboard the ships. A trade that involves enormous numbers of women, you know, something like a third at least of the captives being moved on the ship are female, and children, some of them incredibly young with really terrible experiences with the business. There's a lot more to be written on children in the slave trade, but it's clearly a difficult topic to say the least. So the title, I picked it because it did give that capture in a neat way that this was a book about people who deal in humans, right? Men meaning sort of humanity. Well, that's what I meant it. But I can see how it can also be construed as seeing that the focus is on men in the book. So it's a reservation I shared myself when I was selecting it. Maybe the soul stealers or something like that might have been a better way to encapsulate who these people are. In terms of the women and children within the slave trade, if we just talk about the enslaved women who were dragged into the vortex of the trade, what I try and show throughout is, you know, their experiences tend to be very different as they move through. You know, the processes by which people are selected as to who will be moved to the African coast and who will be retained in the interior are often based on people's gender. We see that very clearly in places like the Bight of Biafra, where larger proportions of men are retained to harvest yams, which are the primary sort of crop there, and large numbers of women are moved to the coast. But in other societies, women tend to be retained in African slaveholding societies. So we see larger proportions of men being moved to the coast. The selection of captives on the coast is shaped by people's gender, so women have different experiences there. Throughout that process, on the ships are kept in different sections of the ship. They're kept behind the main mast where the crew are throughout the voyage. They have a different experience there. And then the sails in the Americas are also, to a degree, premised on people's gender too. So I try and show throughout the gender is really important as a factor in determining enslaved people's fates, but also their experiences. And that applies as well to age. Children tend to be, again, retained in Africa or shipped to the coast depending on their age. They have different experiences on the ship. Sometimes they're kept above deck rather than down below with the adults, close to the crew. They're sometimes employed as sailors. And then their fates in the Americas are usually quite different. They're often sold to people who want to get apprentices or servants to work in the towns or in a plantation house. So, and this is something that, you know, I really think we need to do more. I mean, obviously there's great work on gender in the slave trade and to a lesser extent age in the slave trade, but there's a lot more to be said there, I think, on the differences between enslaved people in terms of their age and gender and indeed their health and how that shapes their passage and their experience. What was your women slave traders? You see very few of them who outfit slave ships in Britain. You do see widows who inherit shared slave ships will often hold onto a vessel for a couple of voyages and then sell it on. So they tend to be the wives of deceased male slave traders. And actually looking at the records of who sells captives to the ships in Africa, you don't see many women appear there. I'm scratching to my head to think of any women who are there in the records of, say, Bonny or Old Calabar or even on the Gold Coast. But that's not to say that women weren't slave traders in Africa and weren't important. We know they were, especially the Portuguese slave trade, intermediaries between the Portuguese and the Africans in the interior. They're not crewmen on the slave ships. The one place I really did see large numbers of women was as slave buyers in the Americas, especially as buyers of people who were sickly captives who were remaining at the end of the sales. I think there were a lot of women who were buying captives, trying to heal them up and then resell them, who are inhabiting port towns. But also we see women planters who are purchasing large numbers of enslaved women, large numbers of enslaved people. So women are really important to this story, both the enslaved and the enslavers, I would say.
Yeah, this is, and you are right. I think that here is the British component. If you compare perhaps with the Portuguese and Luso-Brazilian slave trade, this is where when we find more women. But there is still studies to come out about that, and I know historians who are women historians who are doing this work. And I would like to ask then one final quick question. What is next? What is the next project that you are working on?
Oh, I'm glad you asked me that. So while I was wrapping this up, I got increasingly interested in the manufacturing of gunpowder for the slave trade. So I found out there were these archives of 5 different mills that all supplied powder to the slave trade. Special powder that was designed specifically for Africa. So I created a paper out of that. And through getting into that, I've got increasingly interested in the intersection between the firearms and slave trades. Initially in West Africa, because obviously you see a huge number of guns being shipped to West Africa, but also to North America, to Native Americans, to people in the Indian Ocean, and African people in the Indian Ocean, and then people in the Pacific, especially New Zealand, where I used to live. So I'm moving on to look at the intersection of the firearm and slave trades in world history. And I'll start with Africa and sort of branch out from there and look for areas where you see parallels of guns, how they animate slave trades or how guns are used in different ways by different indigenous societies.
Oh, this is really an important work to be done. I'm glad that you are doing that. Then, Nick, thank you so much for coming. Thank you for this beautiful book, which is Traders in Men, Merchants, and the Transformation of the Transatlantic Slave Trade. Then Nicholas Radburn, historian at University of Lancaster. In this book, was published by Yale University Press in 2023. I call your attention that the book has also an audiobook version that you can find here in the US on Amazon. Then if you want to read, but if you want also to listen to the book is also in audio format. And thank you, Nick, so much for coming. And I hope that those who are listening or watching that will continue with us for the next steps. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Anna. Bye.